What's going on, guys? It's Simo. So today I'm bringing to you my competitive tier list for the June 2021 format. We had a ton of tournaments take place this past weekend, including some Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganzas, but this was the first big weekend for Lightning Overdrive, so we really got to see what the new cards were capable of, and boy, did they not disappoint. So we're just gonna go ahead and head on over to Tier Maker so we can get straight into the tier list. If this is your first tier video, we've got tier 0, 1, 1.5, Rogue, and everything else. The higher up on the list is the more powerful a deck is, but also the more represented a deck is as well. And we've got about 26 decks to talk about here, so let's go ahead and dive right in. First up, Code Talker. Code Talker is a deck that was like an interesting rogue deck for a time, but I definitely think it has lost a lot of favorability as of late, and is a deck that you will see very fringe, you know, if you're playing at like the local level or things like that. So I'm going to throw this down into everything else. This did see a spike in play initially at one point, but it just hasn't really seen a lot of play, but a deck to keep your eye on. We also have Madolche going into the everything else category as well. Madolche is a very powerful deck, and it's one of those weird decks that sometimes makes its way up to Rogue because the fact that it's this combo deck that really interacts on an axis that not a lot of other decks do at times, that it can sometimes find its way in metagames, and there are people who are extremely devoted to this deck, but for the time being, Madolche is down at everything else. But speaking of Rogue, we actually have our first Rogue deck coming in here at Virtual World. Now, I've had Virtual World at like tier 2 in the past list. That may have been a little bit generous, but this deck actually is like one of the top 10 decks played and has like a 59% win rate. But I moved it down to Rogue for this tier list because we're at the dawn of a new format and a lot of stuff really hasn't solidified yet. Virtual World actually has a lot of interesting ways that it interacts with some of the top decks once we get into the higher tiers here because of the way that it plays and the fact that it's a sort of mid-rangey deck that has some unique tools that not other decks do. Something to keep your eye on. This deck has actually been doing reasonably well leading up to the Lightning Overdrive format, and so I wouldn't be surprised if when July rolls around, maybe a ban list comes and checks some of the top decks, that maybe Virtual World is still a tier 2 contender. Even without True King of all Calamities, the deck is still actually pretty good. That actually is going to lead us into a brand new deck that we've never covered before on the tier list, and that is At Ignister. Now, I'm going to throw this into Rogue because this deck is having a bit of a spike at the moment, and that is thanks to in part to Lightning Overdrive, the new Link 1, which is like the Balinks of the deck, if you want to call it that, which kind of help brings the deck all together. And so there have been a few people piloting this, especially some better players. We have seen people like Andreas Torres in the past actually playing a deck like this, who's one of the greatest players in the game, but that was before we had the new support for it. But this did get an extravaganza top this past weekend, and if you look at on the lower level, there have been a few tops for this deck here and there, and people on the higher rungs of the ladder on the online platforms are also trying this deck out too. So maybe some validity here, maybe it's just going to be like a Code Talker instance where it's going to be something that has a spike and then comes back down. But I would say educate yourself on what these At Ignister cards do, because this deck is actually pretty interesting. Infernoble's up next. This is just another everything else deck, unfortunately. This deck can be very explosive, but obviously it's nowhere near as powerful as it once was just because of the hits it's suffered recently, and just the way the meta's shaping up, the deck really isn't that good. Now, I would say just, you know, be mindful that people are still playing it here and there because the deck can still do some pretty crazy things, but it's definitely more of a glass cannon than it once was. That's going to bring us, though, to our first tier 1 deck of the format, being Tri-Brigade. We have the brand new Link 2 from Lightning Overdrive, the Bear Braum, which now allows you to search your Tri-Brigade Revolt. Now you're not having to rely on hard drawing the card, and that is what has taken this deck and pushed it over the top. This deck is crazy strong. Revolt is an absurd card. The fact that you have the ability to just do so much with so little, and the fact that the deck is so efficient with its resources, this deck was one of the most played decks this past weekend, and you can expect to see a lot of Tri-Brigade moving forward, so you better be prepared to play a lot of Tri-Brigade in the future, more specifically the Tri-Brigade Zodiac variant that is the most popular, just splashing a small Zodiac engine so you have access to Zeus, but also so you can quickly load up the graveyard with Tri-type monsters, and that way you're able to more easily access your plays with your Tri-Brigade monsters. But fantastic deck. I mean, this deck is just crazy, and again, this is not going anywhere anytime soon. Speaking of which, Hero is another deck not going anywhere anytime soon, and that's why it is also in the everything else category. I think this recently had like a top 16 at a Yu-Gi-Oh! Extravaganza, maybe like a month or two ago, but that's like the only thing this deck has done in like the past month or so. So yeah, Hero, unfortunately, I know a lot of people love it, but it's just not putting up the numbers. Alternatively, Altergeist is putting up numbers, which is why I'm going to put this in the Rogue tier. This actually did get a couple tops at some of the extravaganzas that took place this past weekend. It's always like on the peripheral of competitive play, and being a trap deck, it always just seems like every time we make a tier list, like Altergeist is in the Rogue category because the deck is very good. I think Axis Code Talker probably helped out the deck significantly, but even then, the deck's pretty decent, and just be mindful of this one because this deck is always lurking in the depths and always manages to steal some top cut slots for some reason or another, but you know, it's putting up results, so we got to give it some respect. Guru's another deck that plays similarly to Altergeist, but obviously they do have their differences, and similarly to Altergeist, Guru's another deck that can really sneak in and get those top cuts at some of the higher tier events every now and then. Guru's one of the best Floodgate decks you could be playing usually, and that's why people like to gravitate towards it. It's also one of the best shells for like playing Dragoon on top of it too, so don't be surprised if you see some Guru running around as well. Now, Mech Knight was a deck that saw very, very little promise at the genesis of this new format once we got the new ban list, but hasn't really had much success since, so unfortunately this is just going into everything else. Now, this is the deck I know you guys have been waiting for, Mystic Mine. Oh boy. So I'm actually going to throw this into Rogue. This deck has actually topped some extravaganzas lately. Jeff Leonard competed in a PPG event this past weekend that had a pretty significant player count and almost topped it. He was one round away. I believe he made the top 16, but they cut to top 8. And Mystic Mine, aside from just being a total stun deck, Mystic Mine is seeing lots of play in other decks as well. There were a lot of Tri-Brigade decks actually main or side decking Mystic Mine because we were going up against some of the other combo decks. This is a very specific interaction that comes up for the Tri-Brigade strategy that you can Mystic Mine the opponent, and then once you get to one of your Zodiacs, you're then able to Zeus your field because you can attack directly under the Mystic Mine and almost reset the game, but reset it in your favor because then you can go off and start doing all your Tri-Brigade Zodiac stuff. So that's really crazy, but when you look at some of the top decks up here, some of them fold pretty heavily to Mystic Mine. I would say that since Mystic Mine's been having a little bit of a resurgence, more people are cognizant and are appropriately siding spell and trap removal in the form of a spell and trap so they can take care of this. Some players are actually maining it as well, but this card is very, very scary, and just be mindful that Mystic Mine is back in the format, ladies and gentlemen, and some people, like the great Jeff Leonard, are deciding to go all the way and play the deck full speed. But speaking of a deck that doesn't fold to Mystic Mine, Eldritch is up next. This is a tier 2 deck now in my eyes. There's a lot of different ways you can go about this deck, but I believe one of them actually topped the PPG event. Another one actually took first place at YBM's 100-person event for their grand opening. And yeah, I mean, Eldritch is still a pretty solid contender in this format. It's got some unique aspects because of the zombie type. You can actually tech out with Zombie World, which takes care of the Tri-typing and Tri-Brigade and a lot of other applications too. So you don't have to play like the pure Eldritch variant. The ones that were doing well recently were actually playing a decent zombie core in addition to the Eldritch cards as well, but there's some other variants too, right? I mean, Dragoon Eldritch is still very popular. I think Orcust Eldritch is also a deck that has a little bit of steam behind it, but I'm with the new format in Lightning Overdrive, I'm not sure if that is the case. Eldritch is the deck that doesn't die, but it's a tier 2 contender for sure, but a pretty decent one at that. Adamancipator's up next. This deck really hasn't been doing all that much, so I'm putting it in everything else. Again, you may come across this online or maybe at your local level because it's still a very explosive combo deck, but it's very glass cannon now, and compared to some of the other decks in the top format, I mean, this deck just really can't keep up like how it used to. Still a crazy deck though. And speaking of crazy decks, this is going to bring us to our tier 1.5 contenders here, which is Dogmatika, Invoked, Shaddoll. Now, obviously, all of these kind of go together, but there are different variants, right? Some people just play Invoke Shaddoll, some people play Dogmatika Shaddoll, but whichever variant of the deck that you're playing, you're going to be taking advantage of Winda in some form or another. And Winda has just been an absolute pain for anyone who's playing combo decks in this format because having that one special summon without having any way to deal with the Winda, as a result of that, people are having to respect it by playing cards such as Forbidden Droplet in the main deck. And I think while this isn't, you know, as good as it used to be, I still think this is probably one of the strongest decks of the format because it's going to check a lot of the tier 1 decks to a degree if they don't have native outs to it. And it's a fairly consistent deck. I mean, it's able to achieve its win condition almost every single game because a lot of the cards in the deck just either search themselves or just replace themselves. The deck is just super, super strong, which is why it's sitting at tier 1.5 in my eyes. Phantom Knight is a deck that's similar to Altergeist, where it's one of those decks on the peripheral, right? it's a deck that can easily steal some top 16 slots in extravaganzas or some higher tier tournaments. I believe there was a Phantom Knight deck that took second place at the 100-person YBM case tournament just after the Eldritch Zombie deck. And again, you're going up against Drytrons, you're going up against Tri-Brigade Zeus. So clearly you're facing down meta contenders here, and that gives the deck a bit of respect. And this has just been a deck that's always been hovering in the rogue tier for quite some time, and it's probably going to continue to do so for the next month or so. Next up, oh boy, everyone's favorite deck is back. Drytron at tier 1. This deck is just incredible. With now the inclusion of Fafnir as well as Diviner, this deck has now been pushed into tier 1 contention, ladies and gentlemen. This deck won a charity tournament recently. This deck also was absolutely everywhere this past weekend, dominating multiple top cut slots in all of the top tournaments, and the deck is just insane. Like, if you've watched this deck play, it is incredible how it's able to play through so many disruptions. Andreas Torres at the PPG tournament took first place with this deck, and he just put on a masterclass for what this deck is able to do. If you can find those videos, I'd highly recommend checking it out, because this is going to be one of the biggest threats of the format until people find a way to get this deck in check, or maybe side deck appropriately. We are still in the early stages of June, but that's why I like to bring you guys these videos now, so that way you're able to prepare for the next coming weeks. And who knows, maybe July comes around, maybe a ban list comes and checks some of these things out. But I honestly think Konami wants to keep Drytron at the top to help sell Lightning Overdrive, as well as Tri-Brigade by extension. So with that logic in mind, I think these decks are probably going to be top dog for the next couple months or so. We'll see what happens, but Drytron's definitely a tier 1 contender. Get your Troll and Lock Birds, ladies and gentlemen, because you are going to need that and much more to deal with this mega threat. Ogdoadic was a deck that we had in the rogue tier last time, but I'm going to throw this down into everything else. Aside from some initial success from the breakout of Ancient Guardians, the deck didn't really do all that much after the fact, and I don't really expect it to do much else for the foreseeable future. Who knows though? It's possible. The engine has a little bit of potential, but for the time being, we haven't really seen many results, which is why we're throwing it into everything else. Salamangreat's another solid rogue deck though. I really do like Salamangreat as not only a rogue deck, but also a budget deck, because it is very affordable. It has a very decent win rate online, and it actually fares pretty decently against a lot of the current meta. Now, obviously, this is week 1 of Lightning Overdrive, so we don't know how it's going to fare as we go into the coming weeks, but for the time being, it can actually be teched out fairly decently, because compared to most decks, Salamangreat's engine is very condensed, and so as a result, you're able to play a lot of cards to combat any particular metagame. So I wouldn't be surprised if this stays rogue, but this actually does have some tops under its belt from the previous format, and so maybe it'll continue to do so, so that's why I decided to give it rogue. Next up is an interesting one. Dragon Link, I'm going to put in tier 1, but that's only because of the record and the history it's had thus far. I think this deck is definitely in decline, because if you look at a lot of the results from the past weekend, it was just the Tri-Brigade Drytron show, and while Dragon Link did rear its ugly head once again, I think a lot of people may be sick of the deck and they're opting to play these newer decks, which are still very strong in their own right, but Dragon Link's still very good, and a lot of these top Drytron and Tri-Brigade decks, if you watch the deck profiles, talked about how they were specifically building the decks to beat the Dragon Link end board, and so with that in mind, Dragon Link's presence is still very well known, and it's still a threat that will persist throughout this format until something happens to the deck, most likely on the next ban list, or unless Drytron and Tri-Brigade prove themselves to be way superior to this deck by comparison. I think it's still a tier 1 contender for now, but I would say it's probably the lesser popular of the 3 at the moment, because when you look around and see all the decks that were able to do well this past weekend, it was just nothing but Drytron and Tri-Brigade at the top. A Dragon Link maybe here and there, but by comparison, this deck was definitely the weakest of the 3, at least in terms of results. Gren Maju, sorry Susu, gotta throw this into everything else, my friend. It's a deck that once people are aware of it, and once people know that you're playing it, the deck becomes significantly worse. It is really fun to have that surprise factor when people don't expect it, but I would say it's down here. It hasn't really been putting up any results whatsoever, so it's gotta be everything else. Sky Striker's been doing actually a bit better since we last talked about it. I actually threw it down into everything else in the last tier list because it really hadn't been putting up any results whatsoever, but we've had some extravaganzas, we've had some other like slightly larger events, and Striker's been not topping, but it's been like, you know, bubbling out of these sorts of events. Sky Striker's also a very good Mystic Mine deck as well, and when you look at these top 3 decks, they all kind of fold the Mystic Mine because 2 of them are combo decks, and Tri-Brigade specifically has difficulty dealing with spell-based removal because it has a lot of monster negation, but not a lot of spell negation, which is why you see them playing Imperial Order and Anti-Spell Fragrance at times. So because of the Mystic Mine interaction, that gives Sky Striker a bit of an opening because Sky Striker can play pretty well under this, and so as a result, I think think that's why Sky Striker might be having a bit of an uptick in play, and so you might expect to see some more Sky Striker, even though Engage is obviously still banned. That hasn't stopped it from being a rogue deck for the past several years, though. Now, similar to Dragon Link, Prankit is also on a bit of a decline, and I'm not sure if it's because it's just week 1 of Lightning Overdrive and people want to play Tri-Brigade, people want to play Drytron and just basically see what the new decks are all about, but Prankit has not had nearly the representation as it has in the past, and so I'm actually going to throw this into tier 1.5 for this specific tier list. The deck is still very explosive. The win rate's in the upper 50 percentile, so like it's still doing fantastic, but in the face of Drytron, in the face of Tri-Brigade, and obviously Dragon Link was already going toe-to-toe with it as is, we're not exactly sure how Prankit is going to fare against the Drytron Tri-Brigade meta, and so I decided to knock it down a peg just for that, but this deck is still very explosive, and people are probably still going to mess around with it until the meta gets a little bit more crystallized and people start to figure out what the truly best decks are as we move post-ban list into the July format. Dinosaur's an interesting one. I'm going to go ahead and throw this into tier 2. It's been topping some extravaganzas and some lower tier events here and there. It did get some brand new support in Lightning Overdrive, being the brand new Scrap Raptor, but one of the biggest issues is that people are already prepared for Dinosaur, and having cards such as Lancia and stuff teched out specifically for that matchup make the deck significantly weaker. You already have Lancia for your Tri-Brigade matchup, although it may not be as big of a blowout compared to something like Dinosaur, but people already have the tools in their side deck to really slow the deck down, and that's pretty unfortunate because I think that's what's really holding the deck back. This could easily be a tier 1.5 deck once the meta sorts itself out and we start to get a little bit of shuffling here in the higher tiers, but for now, I think Dinosaur's at about tier 2 because based off the results, especially this past weekend and the first weekend, I think Dino still has to prove itself a little bit, but there's still a ton of people playing this deck, and the deck is absolutely explosive, so Dinosaur isn't really going anywhere, but I think these other decks are definitely just a cut above the rest. And that brings us to our last deck, which is Zoodiac. This is more the pure Zoodiac compared to the Tri-Brigade Zoodiac up here. I'm going to also throw this into tier 2. This actually had a lot of success at the extravaganzas this past weekend, as well as some of the smaller tournaments taking place as well. Some of the top players were actually piloting this deck just in its pure form because you can play a ton of hand traps and trap cards, almost like a throwback to 2017. And so this is a fairly decent deck that put up some pretty good results. And so I think it's definitely worthy of that tier 2 slot, at least for now, but we'll have to see what happens. We still have plenty of weeks and tournaments to go by before we see this meta fully flesh itself out. We also have a ban list coming out at the end of this month on top of it. So if there's something that's really going to shake things up for the July meta, it's that. We'll have to see what happens, but this is the way things are trending for the time being, and I really hope you guys enjoyed. So be sure to let me know down in the comments what you guys think. That's going to do it for me. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content, and if you found this video informative, consider supporting me on Patreon for exclusive early one-day access to both the Yu-Gi-Oh Progression series and the history of Yu-Gi-Oh. Thanks so much again, and we will see you next time.